Welcome to Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we discuss Trump 2.0's policies and politics and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. Germany's once win-win economic partnership with China has soured into what many now call a China shock, spanning sectors from autos and pharmaceuticals to telecoms and critical infrastructure. Today, I'm speaking to Noah Barkin of the Rhodium Group and a former Reuters reporter. Noah notes that Germany is losing roughly 10,000 manufacturing jobs per month. Volkswagen's decision to cut 50,000 jobs at home while expanding production in China captures this painful dynamic in sharp relief. Meanwhile, China's quiet but consequential role in the Ukraine war, including the supply of dual-use technologies to Russia, is reshaping debates in Berlin and Brussels. As German industry remains torn between de-risking and deeper dependence on Chinese innovation, the stakes couldn't be higher. Can Europe defend both its prosperity and its security in an era of mounting geopolitical pressure and transatlantic uncertainty? Let's hear Noah's perspective. It's wonderful to have you today, especially after Mer's visit to China. Let's first talk about your career.
I was a journalist for a long time, 25 years, and started in New York, then moved to London, to Paris, and Berlin. And I've been in Berlin for over 20 years. I was a correspondent for Reuters, and I left journalism at the end of 2018. My last job as a journalist was following the Europe-China relationship, and I sort of ran with that. Joined Rhodium Group and the German Marshall Fund around the same time, the beginning of COVID, so this was early 2020. And since then, I've been focused on Europe's relationship with China, on the transatlantic debate on China policy, economic security issues. As a journalist, I was very focused on this nexus between government and the economy and business. So I've continued with that, but focused very much on Europe, China, transatlantic China debate.
There's a lot to be discussed. How would you characterize the state of Germany-China relations today? We know the two countries used to have a really robust economic relationship, but it sounds like it's no longer.
No, it's, I would say the debate in Germany or the concerns about the relationship with China began about a decade ago when Chinese companies began snapping up assets, businesses in Europe. This was the peak of Chinese in Europe, 2016, 2017. So that's where the concerns started. And of course, the relationship has, I think, gone downhill since then. Obviously, during COVID was a big, China's image in Europe really suffered during COVID. And of course, there was Hong Kong and the debate about human rights, Xinjiang. But I think over the past few years, the relationship has become particularly strained because of two main reasons. One, China's support for Russia. Germany is in the midst of a military buildup. There's a huge amount of concern in Berlin about Russia and the potential for Russia to move beyond Ukraine and perhaps test NATO in the coming years. So China's support for Russia, the sending of dual-use technologies that are being used on the battlefield in Ukraine, is a really big issue here.
Can I just ask, so even though China has never really said that it supports Russia, right? I think their public statement has always been they're neutral.
I think you're absolutely right that China, in its public statements, talks about its desire for peace, an end to the conflict. It's interesting to see the contrast between China's reaction to, for example, Venezuela or Iran when they talk about territorial integrity. They've never really used that language specifically with regard to Ukraine. There was never any condemnation of Russia's full-scale invasion. And of course, just weeks before Russian troops marched into Ukraine in 2022, Xi Jinping met with Vladimir Putin and they sealed this no limits partnership. So I think the consensus is that China did not know that what Putin was planning, but China has continued to support Russia, obviously buying Russian energy, but also sending dual-use technologies that are being used on the battlefield. That is proven. And I think the technologies that China is delivering to, or Chinese firms are delivering to Russia, are becoming more and more advanced. I think that's a big concern in
So
Ukraine right
I
now.
wanted to clarify that this perception that China is indeed supporting Russia is pretty widespread and accepted in Germany, right? Because that's the perception in Washington, D.C., clearly, but that's also the perception. Okay. Yeah.
That is certainly the perception, although I think there are people here in Berlin who emphasize that this is not really an alliance. They put the emphasis on the differences between Russia and China, when in fact, given what we've seen in recent years, we should probably be focused on this closer partnership between Russia and China. That has certainly had a big effect on the Germany and Europe's relationship with China more broadly. It is among the first issues that are raised with Chinese interlocutors when European officials sit down with them. And that's been going on for 4 years. I think in Beijing, they're pretty sick of this at the moment. But it's a huge issue here, because I think it was NATO leaders have described China's role in Ukraine as a decisive enabler. Without Chinese support for Russia, Russia would not be able to carry out this war in the way that they have. So I think that is widely accepted. But it's also widely accepted that there's very little that Europe, after 4 years of trying to push the leadership in Beijing to put pressure on Vladimir Putin to end the war, that has not delivered any results. So I think there's waning hope that Europe can really influence China, convince China to put pressure on Vladimir Putin after 4 years of war.
Setting aside this very important political element of this relationship, the business relationship is an economic relationship is what we're curious how that's affecting the broader relationship. We have seen more engagement in recent months from European leaders with China. And again, going back to Chancellor's visit to China in late February, he actually brought a large business delegation with him and visited many companies, including the very famous Unitree Robotics, and watched them perform in Hangzhou. I think he also met many CEOs at those Chinese technology company CEOs in Beijing and Hangzhou. What message do you think he was sending from these activities?
Maybe a bit of background on the broader economic and business relationship. That has shifted quite significantly just over the past year. If you go back a few years, the view in German industry was very positive on China. Certainly, if you go back before COVID, this was really a universal view in German industry, apart from a few companies and sectors that like steel and solar, that China, that Germany should pursue close economic relations with China. China was a lucrative market, and that this relationship was really a win-win, to use a Chinese expression. In the last year or two, where we've seen a growing number of European and German industries, sectors, becoming increasingly concerned about competition from China. So chemicals industry, machine tools, and the car industry as well, although the car industry has doubled down on investments in China in recent years and basically sees its future in China. Now, German car makers have been heavily invested in China for decades. Volkswagen was the first foreign car maker in China. So they have invested a lot over the decades, but they're losing market share there. Certainly in electric vehicles, they are behind Chinese competitors. Certainly in EV battery technology, they're behind. So the dynamic in this relationship has shifted pretty dramatically, and there's a lot of talk in Germany at the moment about China shock. Right? I've been to 3 conferences in the past 3 weeks about the China shock in Germany, in Europe. So a huge amount of concern about overcapacities from China flooding into the European market, challenging German and European companies, but not just, of course, in the home market, but also in third markets. Germany saw itself as the sort of In German, it's called Export-Weltmeister, so the world champion of exports. And this competition from China in manufacturing, heavy industry is really a formidable threat to the German economy has functioned for decades. So this is the context before the Merz trip. The question was, will he talk openly about these economic concerns? It was his first trip to China as chancellor. The expectation was not that he was going to pound his fists on the table and criticize China. I don't think anyone expected that. But the question was, would he talk about these growing concerns? Germany is losing 10,000 manufacturing jobs every month at the moment. And there are different reasons for that. Energy prices have risen since the cutoff of Russian gas. There's a debate in Europe about overregulation, too much bureaucracy. But I think China has a big part in this deindustrialization that we're seeing in Germany.
You were saying how this feeling of China shock has become much more palpable over the last year. Why do you think that's the reason? I mean, was it primarily because of China's overcapacity, so a lot more exports? Or was it also because of the US trade policy? So in a way, Germany is like many other countries that is feeling the squeeze on both sides.
Certainly, the U.S. tariffs have had an impact on German industry. It's a perfect storm for Germany at the moment. Exports to China have fallen precipitously in recent years. German auto exports to China fell 43% last year. They have fallen 66% over the past 3 years. So producing in Germany and selling to China is becoming increasingly difficult. In the Chinese market, German companies used to make huge profits there, repatriate their profits back to Germany. And this was sort of a subsidy for German jobs and German prosperity. There was a very direct link. Increasingly, German companies in China are suffering declining profitability, declining market share, and they are often doubling down, certainly the car makers, reinvesting their profits in China rather than repatriating them and supporting industry at home. Volkswagen just confirmed in recent days that they're cutting 50,000 jobs in Germany by the end of the decade, and they are setting up a major production hub. They have been for a number of years in Anhui province in China. This is at the center of the China shock. German companies unable to export, setting up shop in China, cutting jobs in Germany, increasing jobs in China. That is the dynamic that's going on in the car industry right now.
And specifically, you also talk about how the auto industry has decided to double down in China. But in what way of investment are the companies doubling down in China?
This is something that is not only affecting the car industry, but car makers can produce much more cheaply in China than they can in Germany or elsewhere. The entire supply chain is there. There's an innovation ecosystem in China that doesn't exist outside of China, certainly in the car industry. Chinese car makers are ahead of their German counterparts in terms of EV battery technology, core development, etc. I think Volkswagen has said they can produce an electric vehicle for 50% less in China than they can elsewhere. And there's pressure from the Chinese authorities to localize, right? So they don't want exports from Germany anymore. They would prefer Volkswagen, Mercedes, BMW to be producing in China using Chinese supply chains.
Everyone knows it's more cost efficient to do things in China. In the past, I think people think about China as just cheap labor. But I don't really think that's the main reason why it's cheap to manufacture or produce in China anymore. And then second, in terms of why the Chinese government prefers foreign companies to localize their production, is it primarily because they are still looking for skill transfer? Because at this point, they're pretty good with all the knowledge and skills already. The last 2-3 decades, they've transferred almost most of the knowledge from all sectors to China, and now they're exporting more because their own local knowledge and skills are robust enough. And that's why you're seeing a lot of innovations. So what is the reason that they still want foreign companies to localize the production?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll answer the second question first. In China for a number of years, there's been this dual circulation push. In other words, China has been pushing to become less reliant on the rest of the world and to make the rest of the world more reliant on China. So I think this is part of it. Of course, if you're a German car maker and you're producing in Germany and exporting to China, you're not creating jobs in China. So that is another reason that China would like to see companies investing, doing JVs with Chinese firms. I think in the past, this was about sharing technology. Increasingly, as Chinese car makers have leapfrogged their European and American counterparts in EV technologies, it's less about the technology sharing, and it's more about jobs for Chinese workers. It's about access for Chinese firms to the European market. If you have, of course, we're seeing in the US that the market has closed down to Chinese cars. That happened under Biden. We'll have to see how things develop under Trump. But right now, the assumption is that the US market is essentially closed to Chinese electric vehicles. By having European car makers invested in China, that makes it more likely that the European market will remain open to China, because these German car companies are very heavily integrated in many ways with Chinese firms in JVs, in terms of shareholdings. Chinese companies own almost 20% of Mercedes-Benz, for example. I think that's the rationale: less dependence, more jobs in China, and keeping European markets open to China. Remind me of
The
your
first
other
one is
question.
about why is it more efficient?
First of all, the entire supply chain is there. And China has created these industrial ecosystems where if you're producing in Europe, you have to bring in inputs from China, from other parts of the world, and produce in Germany. In China, you have access to everything. For example, critical raw materials. China has moved in and is dominating many in rare earths and other critical
So it's a
minerals.
better ecosystem. That's why it's more efficient.
Yes, an industrial ecosystem which makes it more efficient. There are lower overheads. There's subsidization which goes on in China, preferential financing, and you have all the suppliers there in this same industrial ecosystem.
Yeah. I thought it's interesting. I'm sure you've seen that video clip as well. The chancellor was praising China's efficiency. He was saying how China can build the largest solar farms in just a few months. And then in the EU, it would just take a few years to even approve the permitting. And so therefore, he now wants to change the permitting process. So just recognizing the efficiency of the Chinese system, which I think, all sectors have experienced.
Yeah, time to market is much faster in China, and they call it China speed. Of course, the regulations are much more conducive to speedy production, and building a factory there takes a lot shorter time, permitting all of this.
Now, after his trip, as you alluded previously, that there was a concern or a question whether he was going to raise overcapacity issues with China. What do you think Germany is prepared to do to help defend its own industries? Will they use some of the trade tools like the US?
Well, this is the big debate in Europe right now. The European Commission has a strategy which is based on 3 pillars to promote European industry. So industrial policy, reducing regulations, boosting innovation, completing the single market. That's promote. There is partner, which is diversifying trade to other partners. The EU just sealed a free trade agreement with India, has a free trade agreement with the Mercosur countries. So that's the partner side of diversifying. And then the other pillar is protect. So that is about using trade defense tools, tariffs. It's about using some other tools like cybersecurity restrictions to restrict the role of Chinese firms, although it is not explicitly, these tools are not described specifically as tools aimed at China. Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, can't wake up in the morning and tweet out that she wants 100% tariffs on China, right? The EU is still very rules-based, and when it decided a little over a year ago to impose duties on imports of Chinese electric vehicles, this was an arduous 1-year process of investigating and trying to get European member states on board. And in the end, it was very legalistic. It was very technical. They were looking for the exact amount of subsidization and tariffing Chinese EV makers who were producing in China. There were some Europeans as well, based on this level of subsidization. So very, very precise, targeted, narrow. This process took over a year. It was hugely politically divisive in Europe. In the end, the tariffs came in at a level that were not prohibitive for many Chinese car makers. And plus, on top of that, there was Chinese retaliation against French cognac, European pork, European dairy. If a lot of European capitals look back on this very painful debate about tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and say, we spent a year doing this, what are the results? The results were not that good. So now there's a push for something bolder, and that pits Germany, which is traditionally a free trade nation, likes open markets, against a country like France, which is much more willing to impose tariffs. So there's a new report that came out of the French Prime Minister's office in recent weeks, which called for a 30% across the board tariff on China, all products. Germany is not there yet. So Germany and France have to come together and reach a consensus on this. I think the European Commission, which has control over trade policy, would like to be much bolder, but they're restricted by the EU rules on trade policy, which do not allow Brussels to be aggressive in the way that the US is.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see how the EU is going to deal with China when it comes to trade-related tools. I suspect that it would never get as aggressive as the US. Can individual countries have their own set of rules, or it has to be European-wide?
Well, in terms of tariffs, it has to be European-wide. The French, for example, have introduced a scheme, climate environmentally friendly scheme, whereby only electric vehicles that have a small carbon footprint receive subsidies. So that makes it much more difficult for Chinese car makers to qualify for this unless they're made in Europe, because they have to be transported. They don't have the same environmental rules in China. So the idea behind this was to protect French car industry, but also incentivize Chinese car makers to invest in Europe and in France, obviously, instead of exporting. So there are tools, national security related tools, where the member states can decide for themselves. But on trade policy, it's really the European Union that decides.
Yeah. So I think the auto industry gets most attention, probably. Let's also touch on a few other industries. I think pharmaceutical is quite interesting. How has that been impacted?
Just recently, I would say, pharmaceutical companies in Europe have begun to experience Chinese competition in China, in third markets, and increasingly in Europe. This is not a sector that has been complaining loudly about the need for trade protection. China is a very lucrative market when it comes to pharmaceuticals. It has an aging population. There are many reasons for European pharmaceutical companies to want to have a presence in China. But this is an area where there's going to be increased competition as well from Chinese companies. And a lot of the products that go into pharmaceuticals are made in China. So there is a dependency there as well.
I think that relationship I'm not sure if it's entirely similar to the auto industry, especially more recently, there's just more biotech innovators coming out of China. Maybe it is similar in the sense that you have all these Chinese locally branded EV companies that they can innovate and produce their own top quality, whether it's trucks or cars. So the relationship is going to be they will compete with some of the top
Yeah.
brands, right?
Yeah.
Pharmaceutical companies.
I think they will. I mean, it's become much more difficult in the Chinese market because China has also changed the way it procures pharmaceuticals, and the priority has been to foster the growth of local companies over Western firms. So there is a lot of concern in Europe that big pharmaceutical companies will be disadvantaged because local players have a privileged position.
Now, what about the telecom critical infrastructure industry? That probably touches on national security more. And how has Germany thought about that particular industry?
If we're talking about removing high-risk suppliers, any suppliers like Huawei and ZTE from their 5G network. This is an area where the debate in Europe started back in 2018, 2019, I think triggered for the most part by the United States. This was under the first Trump administration. There was a real push to convince allies to push Chinese suppliers out of their next generation telecommunications networks. But if you look at Europe, it's very patchwork picture in the sense that some countries, Germany has about 2/3 of its radio access network is Chinese suppliers. But if you look at a country like Sweden, Sweden banned Huawei completely from their 5G network. And there are a lot of other countries somewhere in between. The French have been more restrictive, and countries like Hungary, of course, have been less restrictive. So this is kind of an example of a European failure in the sense that Europe has the two companies that compete with Huawei in Nokia and Ericsson, and did not double down on Nokia and Ericsson, continued to use Huawei gear. At the same time, Nokia and Ericsson's market share in China has dwindled to almost nothing.
Is it just that the concern about national security isn't as great? That's why still 2/3 of the network in Germany still uses Chinese vendors? Or is it that it's already in the system? It's so hard to get rid of, where the costs are too high?
For a long time, the concerns about national security were not where they needed to be. And I think Germany traditionally has a problem telling its companies what to do. The economic policy is based on something called Ordnungspolitik, which is this ordo-liberal approach, which says the government establishes ground rules, but basically stays out of the economy and lets companies do what they want. We're in a new world where security and technology are one in the sense that I think in the past we used to be able to separate technology concerns from security concerns. Now there is this nexus of trade, technology, and security. And I think Germany really struggled with this new world and for a long time thought that they could continue to treat these issues separately. So some of the big telecoms providers said, we need to use Huawei, it's cheaper. And the government was very reluctant to tell them, no, this is a national security concern. We're going to force you to remove Chinese 5G gear from the network. So it's not that national security concerns did not exist. It's just that the focus on cheap products and bolstering the economy overall had a higher priority than national security. I think that is in the process of changing. I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine has sort of changed this. China's coercion when it comes to critical raw materials has changed the debate here. That has changed the debate here, but still national security is not as big of a concern as we've seen in the US or some other countries like Japan.
It's interesting to hear that you think it's changing. in terms of recognizing how important national security is in the economic sphere. That's related to my next question is how much de-risking do you think Germany will adopt in its supply chains moving forward? Or would it be we need economic growth and it's so important because there's zero growth? We're willing to continue to risk the national security side of things and prioritize economic growth. That's number one. Number two, in the past, the Western world look at China as the marketplace. You sell to China, you make a fortune. And now increasingly it's a competitor, but likely in certain sectors and probably more in the future, they'll have to learn from China. Where do you think Germany is right now?
On de-risking, the European Commission and its president, Ursula von der Leyen, has championed, but there's been more talk about de-risking than there's been actual de-risking. You can look at certain areas, critical infrastructure, where European governments have taken steps. For example, in Germany, a company that was developing a wind farm in the North Sea last year using Chinese wind turbines, the German government put pressure on them to use a European alternative because of concerns about sabotage and security concerns. So there have been some steps that have been taken, but as I said, in the 5G network, Chinese suppliers still have a big presence in Germany, and there's no sign that they will be pushed out anytime soon. So I would say the dependencies are growing rather than being reduced at the moment, because I think the natural trend is toward more Chinese inputs. We talked about overcapacities. Chinese companies are sending more and more products into Europe. Europe's trade deficit with China is growing. So in a way, if you want to de-risk, you have to push twice as hard in the other direction, because the natural trend at the moment is really towards more reliance on China. You asked about China as a competitor, learning from China. I think Germany is trying to find a sort of middle ground. I talked about the car makers that are investing in China in order to have access to Chinese innovation, this technology ecosystem. But, when you do that, that also increases your dependence. It can make it more difficult to exclude certain products from your market. There's this tension in Germany at the moment. They're seeing more competition. They're seeing more and more companies suffering from this competition. But you also have German companies that have bet on China and that see their future in China. I'm talking specifically about the car makers, and they still see China as the second biggest economy in the world. There's a lot of innovation happening there. So they feel they can only compete globally if they have more China in their supply chains and not less.
And this is not just in the auto sector. We actually see that in, semiconductors and chips as well. I mean, that's the huge debate right now, as you probably follow in the US. Like, do you need to be in China in order to be the most innovative one in the future? It depends on how you see China's role in the future as well. So I think that'll continue to be a, contentious debate for sure.
You will be.
Yes. We've talked a lot about Germany and the EU broadly speaking. How would you say Germany is different from the overall EU positions and approach to China?
I would say that, you have 27 countries in the EU. Every country has their own relationship with China. They have their own interests. Some are heavily dependent on China, some less so. We saw Lithuania in 2021 when they opened a Taiwan representative office, and they came under pressure from. I don't think they expected the reaction that they saw from China, but
they also have relatively little exposure.
They have relatively
Yes.
little exposure. I mean, their trade relationship with China was very small.
Yes.
You have countries like Spain that are, in recent years, have become more opportunistic, seeking Chinese investment. Pedro Sanchez, the Spanish prime minister, has been to China 3 times in the last 3 years, and he's going again, I think, next month. So there are countries that are seeking to lure Chinese investment and establish a good economic relationship with China. France, on the other hand, is pushing very heavily for trade barriers. Germany, I think it's the biggest European economy. It has had the deepest economic relationship with China in recent decades. As Germany goes, I think Europe goes, and on China. If Germany were to become much more restrictive, for example, other economies would follow. So, but you have this tension that we've described, where Germany is torn between retaining access to the Chinese market and pushing back against this increasingly challenging competition with China. So, arriving at a perfect harmony in Europe is illusory. It's never going to happen. But I would say that Germany is the key. Instead of seeking agreement between the EU 27, going forward, what really needs to happen is Germany, France, Netherlands, Poland, Italy, maybe a core group of countries who can agree on a way forward with China to push ahead, and other countries would follow them.
We have to address the elephant in the room, which is how much Trump 2.0's policies have disrupted the traditions and the norms in the global economic order. And many would say that's actually the reason why we see this recent economic reorientation in terms of the relationships with China from Canada, UK to Germany. So how much do you think Trump 2.0's policies will continue to push those middle powers towards China? And will that change if there's a different administration in the US? Or do you see this as a longer term change?
Well, first, I would caution against lumping all of these recent trips together and viewing them through the prism of Donald Trump. I think Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister's recent visit, had perhaps the most Trump flavor to it, in the sense that Carney was explicitly describing this trip as an effort to diversify trade away from the US. But I think Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister's visit, that was in the works for a year or more. Friedrich Merz, he's been German Chancellor for 9 months. German chancellors always go to China in their first year. And so I don't think the Merz trip or the Starmer trip was specifically linked to Donald Trump. At the same time, there is a determination in Europe to avoid a two-front trade war with both China and the US. And I think a more aggressive, a more confrontational US administration in relation to Europe has led European countries to seek to dial down the tensions with China. It doesn't mean that their concerns about China have diminished. It's also important to point out Germany is a manufacturing-based economy. It is far more threatened by China's industrial might than a country like Canada that relies more on natural resources, a country like the UK that relies more on services. So I would avoid lumping these all together. There's definitely an effort to dial down tensions with China, but in a way, Donald Trump makes Europe's problems with China even worse, in the sense that we're seeing trade diversion, Chinese exports being diverted from the US into Europe. That increases the threat to European industry. But as the US, I think the expectation is Trump will continue to pull back support for Ukraine. The burden will fall increasingly on European countries, and that will make China's support for Russia a more acute problem for Europe as this burden shifts to Europe. So I don't think there's a grand bargain to be had between Germany and China, between the UK and China.
No.
But what we are seeing is an attempt to dial down tensions. The big word being used in Europe right now is realism. Principled realism, values-based realism, and realism is a word that one uses when one is feeling very vulnerable and attacked from all sides. I don't see this as a pivot to China. It's much more a hedging process that is taking place.
Yeah. Well, with that, thank you so much. This has been very interesting and insightful. The Trump factor, the China shock, and the dire economic situation at home are forcing Germany into a cautious hedging strategy. Noah Barkin warns that Trump's policies may actually deepen Europe's China problem, driving diverted Chinese exports into European markets while leaving Europe to shoulder a growing share of the burden of supporting Ukraine. Principled realism has become the phrase of the moment in European capitals. And as Noah notes, when leaders reach for that language, it's usually a sign they're feeling squeezed from all sides. This is Perspectives with Wenchi Yu, where we analyze the policies and political strategies of Trump 2.0 and their implications for Asia, China, Taiwan, and beyond. Thank you for watching and listening. We value your feedback. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and podcast. See you next time.